that natural resources that we have today can be still available to future generations through a switch into a renewable resources in a sustainable economy, a circular economy. This same concept can be applied in health and in the health system. If we as doctors, health professionals, clinicians want to ensure to be able to respond to the expectation of suffering people when they come to us with a disease, it's fundamental that we understand what we can do to ensure the sustainability of the system. If the demand of care increases without an equal increase of the offer, we cannot solve the problems. But we know that the offer cannot increase at the same speed and possibly not even at the same limits than the demand, because the factors which are influencing demand are macro factors, are global factors, are increasingly complex factors related to the way our society works. I make an example. On the positive side, we have, thanks to science, thanks especially to the improvement of life conditions for millions of people, we have increased life expectancy. People live longer. Aging population is increasing. And what does this mean? It means that we have more people. The population increases, but also with the population, which by itself, the demographic factor increases demand on a system. And but this increase in population is also connected with the lengthening of human life, which means that we have older people with their problems coming to us. This means naturally that older people have more illness, no? Because just aging brings with itself some human systems don't work anymore at their best, and so they start to have some complications. And very often, more and more, increasingly, older people live with what we call comorbidities. In other words, they have a little bit of coronary problems, maybe a little bit of pulmonary problems. Eventually, some the bones are not so solid anymore, and depending, maybe they're a little bit obese, therefore they come also with some metabolic disorder, and all this comes together. This is a kind of physiologic, demographic increase on demand of the system. And there we can try to adapt to this. But the problem is mainly with not necessarily, not only with the elderly, but with the elderly which have behind a long experience of increasing illness. They have been exposed to, they have been prepared their aging with complications, chronic diseases, which are increasingly cause of mortality globally and obviously of a burden of disease everywhere in the world. Before, when I studied, we would classify, and I completed my medical studies, at least my graduate studies, now some more than 40 years ago. We would study that there were diseases of affluence and diseases of poverty. The diseases of affluence being related to obesity, cardiovascular diseases, and a number of metabolic diseases, which were also related with longer life expectancy. And at the same time, there were diseases of poverty, which were mainly infectious diseases related with a certain level of undernutrition. This is no more true. Today, we have everywhere, even in poor countries, what we call a double burden of disease. Chronic diseases together with acute diseases. Chronic degenerative diseases together with infectious diseases. And we have to deal with them together. This increases the burden of disease, this increases the demand on the system. So not only we have older people, but we have older people with more burden of disease, with comorbidities. And this is strictly linked to the pandemic that we're observing. The results in terms of mortality of the pandemic, we know that the very high percent, I don't know the exact percentage, but over 90% of the deaths are related to people with comorbidities. Older people and young people with comorbidities. There are young people. They are in Italy, the average mortality age for COVID-19 is around 80. So relatively old people. But still, you know, this is an average. So you have, on one side, you have younger people who die. But those younger people, they are, with maybe a few exceptions, they are all suffering of some pre-existing disease, chronic disease, or they are obese, or they have already some cardiovascular problem, they may have some immunitary disease, or things like this. A perfectly healthy person, from statistics, apparently does not die from COVID-19. And this also should give us a big lesson about who should be vaccinated and who maybe is not needed to be vaccinated, even if we push to vaccinate the whole population. We may discuss on this, or you may have discussed this with epidemiologists or with people who are more involved in this. I know that the mainstream message is we should vaccinate everybody, every age, and I'm only waiting to see when they will propose to vaccinate infants. Still, it's not in the proposal, but soon. Soon, because there is a push to vaccinate everybody, and this push is also related with enormous economic interests. But we'll come back on this. Back to the demand on the system. So, elderly people and increasing chronic diseases are putting a higher demand, a higher burden, and increase the demand on the system. But where do these excess of diseases come from? If we would just increase the population and have a young and older population, healthy population, we would have an increase by numbers. That's mathematics. But still, a healthy population is not putting such a high demand as a chronically ill population. Where do come chronic disease? Where do chronic disease come from? As when I studied, there were affluence diseases. Well, they come from affluence. But they come not from affluence in the sense that we can respond to our basic needs. We have enough nutrition, enough food. We have enough water. We have the education we need to manage our life in the best way. We have free spaces to run and enjoy nature. We have the possibility of developing our wishes, our talents. No, it's not only this affluence. Today, affluence means we consume much more of what we need. We are no more citizens, forget it. We are consumers. The system in which we live wants us to be consumers, not citizens. And even more in this pandemic, shut up, do what I tell you, and possibly try to consume, because we have the urgency to come back to strong economic growth. Have you heard any other message? We have to go back to normal. No, my friends, and really my colleagues, we have not to go back to normal. My message today will be, let's go somewhere else, not back to normal. Let's learn from this lesson and understand that we have to change something. If we are consumers, it means that there must be more products on the market, and that to ensure that there are more products on the market, production must increase. And production needs natural resources. Production needs energy. And therefore, we are exploiting through a doctrine of extractivism. We are extracting all the possible natural resources, oil, minerals of any kind for our cellular phones, or oil for our cars. And when oil will not be any more available, we will try to get it out of with some other mechanism from the stones. And then we will eventually look for other minerals, lithium, substituting oil, because now we will become in green economy. We will need, our cars will not be moved by gasoline, will be moved by electricity, and electricity needs batteries, and batteries needs lithium. And for the lithium, in countries such as Chile or Bolivia, the whole environment is being destroyed for the energy industry. So if we are consumers, then there is a whole machine behind us which needs to produce and produce and produce, because they want us to consume more and more and more. And if we consume more and more, we create more and more waste. That waste goes in water, that waste goes in soil, this waste goes in the atmosphere. And believe what? We get sick of it. We can measure how much plastic we are eating every day by just eating fish. What is a healthy, nutritious food? But today we can measure a certain amount of plastic that we eat by eating fish. And obviously we need thousands of years of evolution for our body system to be able to metabolize the plastic. I'm sure we'll get there in some 1,000 years. It's too much for us. We cannot wait. And when we drink water, how many of us really drink clean, pure water? Water which is alive. And when we don't drink it from plastic bottles, which again bring some microplastics into our diet. So you see, I mean, it is we are in an economy, in a development system, which is destruction of what we have, to leave nothing behind. But back to the health system, all this makes us more sick. The diet, with what we eat in the food, plus the excess of food we eat, the quality of food we eat, which is produced with the same mechanism of consuming, in a way that we eat more and cheaper. Because if it's cheap, we eat more. So obesity is not, coming from who knows where. It's coming from precise economic objective of letting grow certain industries which know very well how they can make a strategic marketing to induce consumption, and therefore to induce disease. We have to stop to eat processed food, because in processed food, unless elaborated in a certain way, because there is also a healthy industry which is trying to make it better, processed foods are all added with sugar, are all added with salt, are all added with some trans fats. They're all added with some preservatives, with some chemicals, which are nothing good for our health. But we increasingly are exposed to this. We are exposed to chemicals not only through food. Take a moment today when you are, before going to bed, go make a walk in your house, even a very small apartment, or even if you are in a student house. Look in your bathroom, look in your kitchen, and try to check how many chemicals you have around. Any detergent, any, washing tool, anything you need to perfume your room, or that you put on your body. Look at it. Look at how many chemicals there are in it. We know the cancerogenic activity of about some 1,000 chemicals coded. We have in pipeline to study and know more another, let's say 50,000. But we know there are more than 250,000 molecules that we have no idea how they behave in our body, how they behave in the environment, and how the impact they have on our health. And daily we are exposed. You may have heard as medical professionals the idea of endocrine disruptors. This is the action that chemicals produce in our body, whether from the surface or by ingestion or through breathing, which alter our hormonal mechanisms and produce normally important alteration that then on the long term, and sometimes not even so long, they conduce to fundamental changes of our metabolism, and including, this is the science of epigenetics, including changes in our genome. And if this touches the reproduction genome, then the reproduction chromosomes, then it will also, the damage through these substances in our body today are transmitted to future generations. So you see that if we live longer, but we don't live a better quality of life. We live with illness that then we are able to correct with certain intervention, medical intervention. But the run is faster on the side of the determinants rather than on the side of the offer. And therefore the system becomes unsustainable because too many people, too many sick people cannot find an answer in the offer. And on top of this, we have geopolitical phenomena, which create, for example, migration. People who migrate, but not because they are international students and go to study somewhere else, or like me, who decide to live part of their life abroad. No, people who have to migrate because the economy doesn't responding to the opportunities they seek, because there is no more water, there is no more forests, or there are conflicts for water and forests and minerals. There are situations and natural disasters, and so we have increasingly populations from one continent to the other, which are pushed out of their country because they are in need. Actually, the best of them are those who can migrate because they have the strength to migrate. But then they will fall in poverty somewhere else. And they will somehow disrupt the systems of the country, of the hosting country or the immigration country. So you see there are very complex factors that we have to add to understand the pressure which is put on the system. On the other side, we know that there is a medical industry, biomedical industry, who pushes for the system to have constantly new technologies, which cost much more, but they will not gain the run against the increase in demand. A good example is, and this will lead us very easily back to pandemics, is antibiotic resistance. The industry we had since the discovery of penicillin, we have had an availability of an increasing number of antibiotics with which we have defeated many or almost defeated. Actually, the only disease we have defeated by vaccination. This is smallpox. But many diseases have become less a problem. My generation would think that syphilis is not the problem. Your generation, the new generation, has to take into account that syphilis is again a disease which may be very complicated. We believed that tuberculosis was over, or at least we had all the tools to fight against tuberculosis. Today, you have to work with multi-drug resistance tuberculosis. And the industry is not able to produce constantly and so much and new drugs, and they will cost more. It will cost more on the system, making the system unsustainable. And you know where the antibiotic resistance comes from? You think from prescribing antibiotics? Yes, But the most important source of antibiotic resistance is the use of antibiotics in chicken and in cattle. So in agriculture, in farming industry. And why do we use, or humanity or producers use antibiotics in the farm industry? Because they want us to consume more. They want to sell us more chicken. And therefore they put all the chicken all together, compacted under constant 24-hour over 24 hours light in order for them to eat constantly. But in those conditions, chicken as humans would soon become infected. You imagine an epidemic, we are making a lockdown to face the epidemic. So imagine chicken. If they are all together, like when we go all together to a football game or go all together to a party and there is one infected, we get all infected. Transmission, we have learned it with the epidemic. Okay, in the chicken happens exactly the same thing. But if you put them all together, you know, in the chicken house, one by one, they cannot move. They can only eat and eat and eat. Then they get some infection. And therefore, in the food, the producer puts antibiotics, preventive antibiotics. And that antibiotics goes in the meat of the chicken, in the water with which the chicken house is cleaned up, and therefore goes in the water. And we can find and we can measure antibiotics in rivers, in our water, the water we drink. And obviously, we know that the bacteria learn little by little, small quantities, very diluted antibiotics, the bacteria learn because they have a very fast evolution. They don't need 1,000 years that we need to metabolize plastic. They mutate and change in a generation, in many generations in one day. So they are exposed to small non-killer quantities of antibiotics, and they transform their genome in order to adapt antibiotic resistance, antimicrobial resistance. We have this, we are pushing actually, through our use of antibiotics, we are pushing the bacteria to transform and to nullify the weapons we had against them. And this also depends by our prescribing policy. So please don't prescribe antibiotics just as a solution. I don't know what to do, let's give it antibiotic. That's not good medical work. Well, now you understand that we cannot analyze a pandemic like COVID-19 just thinking, okay, there is a virus. We still don't know the origin of the virus. You may have read the recent report of WHO saying it's highly improbable that the virus comes from a lab, but they don't deny this possibility, that it's highly improbable. It possibly comes from a bat. However, I discovered, things that we can discover. I suppose I'm a relatively educated person, and I have always thought and said, including in classes, that the transmission from the bat is because in Chinese wet markets, bats were sold because Chinese would eat bats. I had to learn from a Chinese student that I was saying a stupidity. Chinese do not eat bats. So there were no bats sold in Wuhan. There are other people who do eat bats, for example, Indonesians. So all the pictures that we have seen about the Wuhan market or passed through as a Wuhan market with bats, they come from Indonesia. And that gives you another information about communication. And it's difficult to get the right information. Okay, in any case, we know that this SARS-CoV-2 virus has a direct link with the bat or possibly indirect through another mammal, possibly a pangolin, a name that I learned also through the pandemic because before I had no idea of the existence of a pangolin. Okay, so there is an animal source. Whether this animal was in the lab or this animal was in the forest or came frozen from somewhere else, or some Chinese citizen was exposed somewhere else to the bat or to the pangolin. We know from the genome, from the phylology of the genome, that it comes from possibly a bat or another mammal. And how did we get in touch with this? Obviously, here the answer is we have penetrated as human beings an environment which does not belong to us, belong to wild animals. And this is why most of the pandemics that we fear, this is the first, it's not the last. Actually, it's not even the first. You will remember there was a SARS in 2003. You will remember there was a H1N1 in 2009, influenza pandemic coming from a swine influenza. This is not the first, and this is not the last. Be prepared. Because if we don't change the system, if we don't make a paradigmatic change of the system in which we live, we will see more and more. And this takes time. So we have to mitigate, adapt, and possibly change. But all the pandemic risk is related to zoonosis, is related to our breaking the barrier, whether for the forest industry, the wood industry, which destroys the Amazonas in order to extract wood, or because we are going with the mining industry in the middle of Africa to get cobalt out of those mines, or in China or wherever. We have broken the barrier. We have invaded the space which does not belong with us, and we have invaded it without the needed respect. One thing is going hiking in the forest and appreciating nature and loving nature and listening birds and looking at the beauty of nature. Another thing is destroying nature to take whatever we can in order to become richer, a few of us. Today, our theme is health, right, or privilege. So if we put priority health, then we have to reduce the privilege of certain limited number of people who work on our being consumers and increase their wealth. We know that today there are reports from organizations like Oxfam or UNDP. We know that today there are some 300, 400 people who alone have managed the wealth of half of the population of the world. That is privilege. That is concentration of wealth. And this is the result of this non-respect of nature, non-respect of the environment, which are destroying the very fine balance that there is in all living being, and that biodiversity is gone. And with this, the push on this, what we call spillover, the capacity of microorganisms to go beyond the barrier, natural barrier, which is, it's built in our bodies, and is, they jump it. We have this spillover, and then we have to face new organisms to which we have never been exposed. Just like when the Eskimo were exposed to common cold, they would die like we die today with coronavirus, because the Europeans or the civilized population brought to very isolated area the common cold. Or you may know that most of when the conquerors came from Spain to Latin America, they caused enormous death in local population, not because they killed them with their weapons, with their sword, but because they killed them with disease. They brought tuberculosis, for example, to the Latin America, to the American continent. They brought other diseases which were not known because they were in isolation. So at that time, it was humans which favored the spillover. Today, it's humans who favor the spillover because they invade other spaces where other beings were living in isolation. So first of all, my first message is, if we want to ensure future universal access, or at least acceptable access to healthcare services, we need to make an effort to reduce demand and therefore to increase health, reduce disease. If not, we will not succeed. And to do this, we have to leave by side a little bit of privileges and try to understand humanity as a unity which should help each other to improve these conditions. But now let's come to the very subject of this talk. Actually, I asked Shoruk in the introduction to say that you can interrupt whenever you like. If you raise your hands, you interrupt, or you make your questions in the chat, and then eventually Shoruk takes them up and communicate them. But please do interrupt. Now I will go into the vaccine issue because it's important. So we learned that we learned from the pandemic that it is not just an isolated Chinese disease. As some would pretend at the beginning. And actually there is a saying in Italian which is ride bene chi ride ultimo, which means it laughs good who laughs the last. And when we were looking at the Chinese epidemic, we said, oh, this is a Chinese story. And when we would say, jokes like, if in the bus there is no place, you just say there is a Chinese around and everybody would go down, or things like this. We make a joke. And then a little bit later, Italy was under the fire of the coronavirus. And then there were others laughing at Italy, and now it's a pandemic. So it's a pandemic, it's a global issue, and the natural way would be to face it as a global community. If you think of movies like Independence Day, when the aliens would come to conquer the planet, then the message was the whole planet would have a planetary council to fight against the aliens. And you would imagine that when we have under the same challenge the whole world, we should come together in the same way. Instead, it was not this the case. We had immediately those enormous corporations trying to make the best profit they could from any kind of industry, and in the pharmaceutical industry, especially with the vaccines, because they are more rentable than drugs. Have you seen that we haven't developed until now, any drug which is with a consensus about its efficacy, effectiveness in fighting the disease? Maybe remdesivir, but still not with a full. And every time that you have a generic drug, which seems to be a good tool, then there is immediately an enormous fight against it, or some at least doubt. Hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, now there is sodium ibuprofenate and others which are coming out, colchicine, and they are still, or not to speak about vitamin C, vitamin D, and I'm not saying they are effective. I'm simply saying that there are not the same capitals put on it to investigate with the substances that we already have available, and possibly that they are already out of the market, in order to have a drug for everybody. If we could cure, or at least reduce the suffering of those who come with COVID into our hospitals, then we have solved the problem. The whole problem is the intensive care units, the incapability of the hospitals to respond. Again, offer is not able to face demand. But if we are able to cure or to reduce the intensity of the disease at home, we reduce the pressure on the hospitals, the problem is solved. Instead, there is a big push on vaccines, because obviously we know that with vaccines we can eliminate diseases. We can eradicate in the case of smallpox. I have vaccinated thousands of children in my life. And I know how valid vaccines can be. But we cannot put every hope in the vaccine. I have said it publicly in many interviews. The vaccine is not the solution. It's a tool. But we should not expect to be the solution in order to go back to normal and again put the machine of the economy to grow and to consume. No, we have to change the paradigm. We have to understand the environmental causes of this situation. We have to understand the societal causes of this situation. My students or former students of the Harvey course, they know, because we have been discussing about this, the social roots. So, and then everything is put in the vaccines, everything in the box vaccines. And obviously there are big interests and people who are, closed view, who say the vaccine are the solution. Some people who are very strong, very, very wealthy and powerful. Mr. Gates, for example. Gates and the Gates Foundation, an organization with 40 billion or 50 by now billions dollars asset, which is promoting health, but the health they consider health, biomedical tools. Now it's vaccine, or directly or through global public-private partnership like Gavi. We cannot put all our hopes in vaccines. Now, instead of seeing the humanity joining in producing, in competing, using all the creativity in all the many industries, in finding the right solution, everybody's competing once against the others. And the curiosity is that all the corporations are moving with public funds. And you know that if something happens with the vaccines, let's say if there are some serious collateral effects, and at some point we want to establish a class action against the corporation has written in the contract, no liable. There is no liability. There is no responsibility for the corporations. All the costs are on the public. All the costs are on the states. But the states didn't even collaborate. They run each for itself. America first, UK first. We don't share. The European Union buying all the possible vaccine they could buy. And I must honestly say that the WHO, together with other public-private partnerships, which are Gavi, I mentioned it before because Gates is an initiator, and CEPI or CEPI, which is another public-private partnership to develop tools for facing emergencies, they have built this COVAX facility, which the idea is to distribute vaccines with equity. But the COVID vaccine, the COVAX facility, which has made a pledge for 2 billion doses of vaccine, only has by now 38 million. In other words, they didn't get the support they needed. And even those donors who pledged haven't still complied with the pledge. So there you have an attempt of a more equitable approach to vaccine acquisition and distribution, which failed because even those donors who have put some money in it, European Union, for example, or United States, then didn't run with that facility. They gave money because you have to be there, but they run for their vaccine, for their population, not about equity, nothing about health right, but mostly as health as a privilege.
Professor, I think we have a question.
Please.
Dolev, are you gonna speak or do you want to write in the chat?
No, yes, tell me if you can.
He wants to write in the chat. I didn't understand why you say drug is better than a vaccine. How can you choose for an individual and say to him that a drug/treatment would be better for him instead of a vaccine? Let's say he'd rather be uninfected than infected and treated in a proper way.
No, I'm saying obviously, if we have a vaccine, we have a tool which may help us to prevent or to get or to die from the disease or even to have the disease. For now, we know apparently these vaccines only prevent to death. They don't prevent infection. And we have lots of incognita, a lot of things we don't know. But if we can have a drug which cures, which avoids us to die, we take it once and it's finished. With the vaccine, unless we will be able to, to eliminate the circulation of the virus, which is, we can doubt it, the possibility is that, as we have seen it with influenza, that the virus will mutate and we'll have to modify our vaccines and run behind the virus. So it's much more effective if we can eliminate it, and obviously costs are much lower. If you have a generic drug which works, would be just fantastic. We still don't have one. We have a hypothesis There are some people who would say absolutely ivermectin solves everything, and then you find on the side of the WHO saying no, we don't have enough evidence about this. So we are far away from having a drug. Instead, we have many vaccines. So no, vaccine may be effective. Again, we don't know how long the immunity will last. We don't know if there will be long-term effects. We know that it is safe and effective on the limited numbers we had during the first phases, and now because we are applying it on enormous populations. So at least from data from the UK, for example, on Israel, where we see that the epidemiologic curve is coming down with an intensive vaccine activity, the hypothesis which would hold that the vaccine is effective. But at the same time, remember, there were also measures of lockdown, also other kind of measures. So we cannot really attribute all the result to vaccine. But my position is that if we have a drug, especially if it's a cheap generic drug that is effective, then you keep it there in your pocket. And if you are with the disease at the first level of care, you take the drug and solve. Yes, on the long term, vaccine may be a solution. But if you don't change the fundamental mechanism, how the diseases, zoonotic diseases are produced, we will not be able to produce a vaccine at every single pandemic. Let's say that next year we have another virus coming in. Starting again, producing a vaccine, and we run after every single disease with a vaccine when we know that the origin is an ecosystemic origin. We have to invest in a different economy. We have to invest in a different way or lifestyle or way of life. Now, this is my position. But I mean, now there is no discussion because there are no effective drugs. But what I'm saying is there is much less investment on searching for such an effective drug than the investment that has been put in vaccines. Simply by announcing the effectiveness of the vaccine, the CEO of Pfizer could sell 60% of his assets, and did sell 60% of his assets, making a personal gain of I don't know how many millions euros in just one night. So there is a big market behind this. This is my message also. We have to understand, and this market is all financed with public money. But if there are problems, it's public money which have to solve it. But let's come to the idea of how the vaccine.
You changed the point, Professor. I think there is a student that wanted to make a question.
Yes. Okay. In voice or okay.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for the very interesting conference and your view on things. I would like to ask something regarding your introduction about something that you said regarding the fact that many people are being vaccinated and maybe it would be a more beneficial approach to prioritize, as we do prioritize, but maybe to focus on the most vulnerable and the older people, the one that they are in greater danger. I would like to ask you, how about then about this so-called 70% that has to be reached herd immunity to protect those that they are not able to be vaccinated? What's your opinion on that, and what would be your approach? Thank you very much.
Well, this okay. First of all, the priority is based on the fact that those who die are, in average, everywhere older people. Now, this is mainly in, I mean, this is not an absolute, as we said, because there are younger people who have comorbidities also die. So we could extend the vaccination to people who have, I mean, if they get sick, they have a high probability to get seriously sick and eventually die. So this is where we should put the priority of a vaccine. Obviously, the herd immunity is the ideal situation, but herd immunity will progress also if the disease spreads. So we have the two things combined. Our highest risk the highest risk is that the vaccines may become ineffective due to the variants, mutations. There is where we don't know really. Now there are some recent information, I think from Pfizer, saying that it seems to be effective also on the existing mutants. So there are still too many things we don't know on the long run. The issue is for sure, I mean, herd immunity is a concept that we know, and indeed, if we reach enough immunity in a population which is said to be over 60, around 70, I mean, there also it's lots of theory, then we should see results. And indeed, we still don't have any country, maybe Israel, where we have covered, including with a good number of second doses, a good part of the population. So Israel could be a very interesting case to observe. You know, it's number one in the capacity, immediately followed by the Seychelles, but the Seychelles are a few islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, so it's easier. Islands for islands, it's easier. I was reviewing which are the countries which are doing best in that sense. But yes, the idea, if from the immunity point of view, herd immunity is kind of not a solution, I wouldn't call it a solution, but a better situation, And we can reach it through the vaccination, and we can reach it through also the spreading of diseases, also asymptomatic disease. It will take longer, but it will arrive anyway. I mean, the history of epidemics is, at some point, epidemics go down by themselves because they created immunity in the population. Where this is, no, I mean, there are projections, there are hypotheses, theoretical models, but really when and how this may be reached, and obviously if there are then variants, and then we have to start again because you need a herd immunity for the variant. So I would not put my, my fish, if it would be in playing in a casino, put my fishes all on the herd immunity. I will try really to understand that we have to imagine a different way of human relations and protections and the way we socialize and little by little establish this more secure environment. But let's, say we put all our energies on vaccines. Let's accept this idea, which is the dominating mainstream idea. We put it all in the vaccines, but then we see that there are distribution of vaccine. US, 53% of the population received a doses. UK, 57%. Israel, I already mentioned, 115%. Leave aside the Seychelles with 107. Chile is one of the few emerging economies, which is in 61%. And actually, they have a problem there because they have a very good coverage at this point, but an increasing number of cases and deaths. So this is a curiosity. And then you have the United Arab Emirates, which had 92 over 100. For every 100 people, they received 92 doses. But then we go to the African continent, and there we have 0.0 per 100 people doses. 0.0. And the 0.9. And this 0.9 is almost all, they are all countries in 0.1, 0.2, and then there is Morocco who has 24. So Morocco changes the whole statistics, okay? Or we look in Asia. Asia, if we take away China, who has 11 over 100, and they have their own vaccines, you have 7.1, which is always much better than Africa, 0.0. But this means that we have an enormous problem with the distribution. Practically in Africa, only the COVAX facility is working. And by definition, by the objectives of that facility, they would like to aim to cover only 20% of the population because the rest must be done with local governmental funds. You see, we have a problem, this vaccine nationalism, as it has been called by Pope Francis and by other leaders. We have here really the idea of a vaccine as a privilege, and that is not acceptable. Whether you like vaccine as the main strategy or you don't like it, but you use it as one of the tools, I mean, it is not acceptable that in face of a pandemic, which means a challenge to the world, countries run by their national interests. That is a failure of humanity. It's not a failure, of some leaders. It's a failure of humanity because we have created a system of competition. We live in a society based on competition. In the university, you learned in the school, you learn that you have to compete with others. We could go back, I pretend to be also a pedagogist. And I say, we have to teach cooperation, not competition, because at the end we have this result. We don't understand that we are facing a challenge, which is a global challenge, and we should be able to put aside conflicts. I know it's not possible. I know it's an ideal. The Pope can ask for this because he can have the power of a divinity. But somehow just intelligence should help us, that we have to do things in cooperation if we want to solve problems. And this is where health is no more a right. Not even health. Health is too big. A vaccine is not even a right, is a privilege. This we are in face of a tremendous distribution failure in distribution. I can give you more data, but I think I'm going really extending too much. But it is interesting to see that already in, what was it, April or May, when we looked at the data about the vaccine, which were still being developed, they already were bought by the countries. Because the country said, when it will be out, then I will be the first. And they have bought millions. And the corporations, they have sold vaccines that today we know they're not able to produce. They take the money, they've signed the contract, that they take out any liability, and then when the moment comes that the vaccine is there, they don't have the vaccine. That's a fraud in the market. You buy a car and it comes without a wheel. How do you call it? You paid it for it. And it's the same situation. Now they will recover, and then obviously the state cannot say no penalty or things, because then they will miss the vaccine. So the corporation, they have the power of having the vaccine. In that sense, the Chinese or the Russian have done it better. Or the Indians, they have their own vaccine, and little by little we will cover their needs. And don't have to fight with the corporations to see who will gain the competition. But I would like to stop it here, because I really would like to have a little bit at least of debate with you.
Okay, there is Sylvia, which would like to ask a question.
Sylvia, yes, please.
Yes, good evening, Professor. Thank you very much. I was just wanted to make an observation on what you were saying, because ideally, what you're saying about a world corporation and a world distribution, it's of course the best solution possible. But is it applicable in real terms? And what my observation is, shouldn't we start to try and approach it from an angle in which at least it is not a battle between the private and the public, meaning that it is not a battle between the pharmaceutical corporation and the governments themselves. And then when it's not between the pharmaceutical companies and the governments, then we can start thinking about how sharing between governments can go. So in other words, about even drastic measures such as confiscate the patent for the vaccinations, for the vaccines, and make so that the production is more intense, is made via public governments, public companies, and once this is reached, then maybe it would be easier to have this international cooperation that you speak of.
Yeah, okay. First of all, there is a natural conflict between the private and the public. Although there is the theory and including a sustainable development goal about public-private partnerships, 17, goal 17, this does not take into account that there are different interests. The interest of the public sector doesn't go with the economic interests of the corporations. No way. So there is what we call health diplomacy, or we can find ways to do things together in partnerships. But obviously, the CEO of a corporation needs to answer to the investors and say how much the profit will be at the end of the year. So there is an issue which can be negotiated, and this is what happens in a global public-private partnership, or what it normally happens between the public and the private. But negotiations, but we have to negotiate knowing that the interests are different. Where is the level of the win-win situation? Very difficult to define. What I say is, however, that the governments, we are still in a world which is not yet post-Westphalian. In other words, still the states, the governments have the strongest leverage if they want, especially northern governments, say European Union, the US, etc. Obviously, it's not the case for African countries which are in the hands of the corporations or foreign interests. At least I would say, when you negotiate, you should negotiate. You should ask and pretend from the corporation the negotiation is transparent. In the European Union, European Union has negotiated with corporations with censorship, including European parliamentarians were not allowed to look into the contract, with leaving the liability to the state and producing with public money. I mean, this is, nobody would go and make a business in this way. But the European Union, in our name, at least for those who are European, made a business giving all the power to the corporations. And now having no tools to defend itself when the corporation is not giving what they promised. But you touched upon a very important aspect, and I was forgetting it, which is the proposal by India and South Africa to use the WTO rules, means the World Trade Organization rules, for which allow, in front of emergencies, for a so-called compulsory licensing, which is waiving the patent right and allowing to copy, to produce drugs and vaccines or whatever locally. Now, vaccines are not drugs. It's not the same thing. You need a kind of a complex infrastructure. But countries like Mexico, like Brazil, like South Africa, possibly in Africa also Kenya, and many others are in the condition of producing vaccines. So if you waive the patent, you possibly can use the same method, the same tools to produce it. There, I'm not an expert, but the message is, so I'm not an expert in knowing what you need to produce a vaccine, but the idea proposed by South Africa and India was phenomenally, I mean, energically rejected by US, Britain, and the European Union, because this would, break a system which is based on patent rights. If you pass it once, then it's passed. Then you have, a precedent that you don't want to have. That is an enormous issue. And so, but this would be a real good way, because this would be, okay, in front of a pandemic, a challenge to the whole world, we can agree that there is no business. We work at costs, not at gain. I also always remember that when Sabin and before him Salk discovered or developed the vaccine against polio, Salk was the killed virus and Sabin the later oral polio vaccine developed, they waived they said no copyright. It's our present to the children of the world, in the words of Sabin. Now, this was another world. This was in the 60s, late 50s, 60s. Was another world. Was not, we had the Cold War, we had other issues, but there was not the competition of everybody on everybody else. I mean, we were not immersed in this idea that competition is the way we should behave in this world. So yes, the idea of waiving the patent would be possibly the best solution, rather than doing like COVAX does, that says public pays for your development of the vaccine, and so you maintain the market mechanism in the same way. The waiver would be a change in what we understand, at least in emergencies, how we reinterpret market. But this is a new world, and this is the new world where I would like you to all to open, to become aware, to create, to think how we can really change it. But this, yes, sometimes is non-real. But I believe, those who were my students know, I believe that it's important to dream. It's important to look forward, to have a horizon to go forward, even if we don't reach the horizon. We need Gramsci would call it the optimism of the will, rather than the pessimism of the reason. To put a little bit of
yeah, it makes it think, because well, even if you explained it, I still can't see why the rejection would be so adamant, and what would actually be the real gain of the countries to not put this step forward. I mean, it's their populations that are paying the price, and as you said, possibly in a pandemic time, which, even if you say, okay, set a precedent, a pandemic is not really a precedent that can be kept in count. I mean, it happened 100 years ago, and it would probably happen again, of course, but right now, this is the first time that we've had such an emergency in modern times, let's say.
Somehow, Silvia, the answer is very easy. The producers of vaccines, which are a very strong lobby, you can imagine the strength of pharmaceutical industries, they are all in the US, in Britain, and in Europe. So governments are still with the idea they don't have to protect their people, but to protect their economy. Economy comes first, then health of their people. Unfortunately, this is the reality. When I make you another example, leave vaccines on one side, just to be very, very clear. I recently, by the way, published a book in Italian, unfortunately, which is Geopolitics of Health, WHO, COVID, and the pandemic challenge. And so what I'm saying is already in the book, even is published. What I'm going to say. Leaving by side the vaccine now, when WHO was discussing about how much sugar should be allowed industry to add in processed foods, whether 5% or 10%, this was a discussion, knowing that a Coke has 25%, just to give you an idea. Then the Italian delegation, so I don't hurt other national sentiments, the Italian delegation went to the World Health Assembly with a representative of the major sweet industry in Italy, Ferrero, just to be very clear, which is worldwide known through Nutella, which I like. But I mean, you have in the political delegation, which goes there to discuss and establish new guidelines about how much sugar should be added, and Italy rejects the resolution of WHO, having in its own delegation the lobbyist. Now you can understand, I mean, and this was sugar, were not vaccines. It's obvious the reasons why they cannot, if they are driven by the lobbies, they cannot accept the waiver. Because it means that tomorrow any other country says, oh, I waive it. I mean, it becomes a practice. And here we are speaking of billions of dollars or euros of profit. So the answer is in the system. It's very unfortunate. I mean, yes, I mean, the logic would be, we are in a pandemic, we are in a global threat, and we should unite to answer all together. But I made the example of the Independence Day. That was a movie. I'm sure that even if the aliens come, that we will shoot everybody on its own and see how I can gain, eventually make an alliance with the aliens against the US or whatever. Huh? Which is the real story. Let me conclude on this, because I mean, you know, I like, but my students know that I like anecdotes. When the Spaniards came to Mexico, this was 500 years ago, and the conquerors, then local people, local nationalities, we would say, local groups, were already at fight between them, among them. So some decided to fight, to ally with the Spaniard conqueror to fight against the Azteca. And obviously didn't understand the conqueror were cutting the heads of both the Azteca or the Tlaxcaleños, which were the allied of the conquerors. So I'm sure that the world has always worked in the same way. And there are some individualism or nationalism which will be privileged rather than the cooperation. But still, as my task is to be an educator and try to have new generation thinking in a different way. So I propose you to work more on cooperation rather than on competition.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, they are all good points, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you for your reply, Professor. I like speaking on the same topic. I would also like to make a reflection, because this competitive nationalist behavior is also, like, from what I understood, not very helpful in practicing containing the virus, because there are different, not just in, okay, there are different aspects where it can disadvantage the fight of the pandemic, because if only one part of the world is vaccinated, then the virus still can circulate into travel, it can get back again. And leaving the virus free to circulate in some countries also aids to the development of variants. So it seems like a blind competitive nationalist behavior that is not really responding to science and the need that we have at the moment. And why is it like that, if also, like, it's not even benefiting your own countries?
I think it's simply short-sighted politicians. You know, the place where we should have coordinated all our activities, the World Health Organization. But the World Health Organization has been put under, you know, judgment by, you know it very well, by the Trump administration, and which used the WHO for its own geopolitical fight against China. And the WHO has been for years underfinanced, not supported by countries. They use it kind of a forum for debate, but they didn't support WHO to play the role we should play. The only answer is to foster multilateralism, which is really in crisis. The Trump administration has enormous responsibility in destroying the system, not only WHO, the whole UN system, including, you know, the environmental agreement in Paris. So there is a big geopolitical issue there. I believe that the solution is to revitalize the multilateral system, the UN system, specifically World Health Organization, but you need resources, you need really to use that forum to find common solutions, including in a public-private approach like COVAX, but as I told you before, I mean, donors entered in it. I mean, the US have put money in COVAX and European Union have put money in COVAX, but then they have gone this, on one side, they say we do it together, kind of saying we help the poor, and on the other side, they compete for getting their vaccines first.
But from what I know, didn't US not decide to participate in COVAX in Russia as well? Like, the biggest country that is actually contributing is China in the COVAX agreement.
China is present. Actually, I don't know the numbers. I haven't reviewed the numbers. If you have the numbers, you could tell to all those who are listening.
No, I don't have the numbers. I just know that the US and Russia decided to not participate, and the biggest participating in the agreement is actually China, and it's actually more about politics, of course, than actually wanting to participate in COVAX.
China didn't enter from the beginning. China entered in October. So came late because they say that they would have an opportunity also to promote their vaccines through COVAX. China is in a very new, no, it's not even so new, it has its own strategy in, if you want, affirming its own position worldwide. There is a Belt Road Initiative, I don't know if you have heard of it, which is an initiative that China has proposed to revitalize partnership with many countries, offering their its own technology and support. And then inside this Belt Road Initiative, they launched before the pandemic in 2017 the so-called Health Silk Road. You may have heard of this. And which is the idea, you know, the Silk Road was Marco Polo, and then, you know, the old road of silk. Silk was produced in China, would come to Europe. That's why the name Health, but now Health Silk Road, an equivalent also Digital Silk Road. And the idea is to use the strategic position that China has built over the years, passing from being a developing country into one of the donor countries today. Until 2011, China was the major recipient of aid, and then became, you know, an emergent economy and the donor. So through this Health Silk Road Initiative, they are trying to promote their technology and their medical assistance fundamentally through the vaccines and through including the masks before, and altogether supporting the health sector, expanding their influence on Africa and Asia and Latin America too, to developing countries. So there is a lot of geopolitics in health, and is managed through what you can offer. And China in this moment can offer a vaccine, they can offer masks and other individual protective equipment. And they use this in order to expand their influence. The Europeans have not followed this idea. And indeed, the big discussion is that with the idea on one side of America's first and the European first, China has taken expanded very much in other continents. For example, I have, this is an interesting data maybe that I can share. Of the vaccine produced, only AstraZeneca is almost present in many 115 countries all over all the continents. And then if you take, for example, Pfizer is only in America and in Europe. And Moderna, again, only United States and Europe. Instead, if you take Sinopharm and Sinovac, they are, beside China, obviously, in Asia and Africa and Latin America, in many, many countries. So really, the American, European, the Western producers have privileged the Western market. And China had taken the opportunity, and the Russians also have taken the similar opportunity to go in the areas where they want to establish a stronger influence from a geopolitical point of view, not only a health point of view. So there is a lot of geopolitics also in the distribution of the vaccines. And what we have to emphasize that we have not followed, as Silvia would consider normal, the collaboration, but we have gone each country on its own way, including in European Union. Those who are following the European Union in these days, they see that every single country is going its own way, and this is very, very sad.
Thank you, Professor. I'll read you a couple of questions from the chat.
Please.
So, from Andrea. Good evening, Professor. Besides the ongoing issue of vaccines distribution, what kind of structure could you imagine to be shaped in the future for a cooperative healthcare?
Again, we have to strengthen WHO. I mean, the overall international cooperation is based on two big channels. One is called the bilateral channel, which is a country, a rich country, establish a partnership with a poor country. Italy, Mozambique, Germany, Bolivia, whatever. This is called the bilateral cooperation. And then we have the multilateral channel, which is through the system of intergovernmental organizations. For example, the United Nations system, for example, the World Health Organization. Donor countries have always privileged the bilateral channel, because it's through the bilateral channel that you have an evident presence in a country and, you know, establish relations whereby you say, okay, I train your doctors, I build your hospital, I provide you with drugs in exchange, whether written or not, you know, implicitly you buy my products, you know my culture, your people travels to my country, and so on and so forth. China is following exactly the same mechanism. Although China, at least in the words of Xi Jinping, his president, now would like to play a stronger role in multilateral setting. And actually, they speak of renewed multilateralism. So I hope this is true words, we don't know. But in reality, a solution is trying to revamp multilateralism, to revamp World Health Organization as in its own mandate, which is directing and coordinating authority for international activities in health. How you get there? That's another question. That depends really of how the political forces, you know, the politics, also the governmental forces, who governs, with what population support, maybe playing our citizenship more of what we do, instead of now saying, no, politics is a dirty world, we should not do, I mean, I don't want to get involved. Maybe we should get involved a little bit more, because if not, we leave it to the few who manage everything. But just look at the news and you will see how difficult it is. I mean, once you have regained, after decades of dictatorship in Myanmar, a democracy or something like it, and now they are again facing a military coup, and the world is going this way. But I really reaffirm the need that younger generation play the role that some of us have played, some of us have not played. We don't leave, my generation does not leave your new generation with a very nice world, I must say. I did my best on my side, but as a generation, I'm not very positive. So, I mean, you have a big task. Do it together.
Talking about this task, Jonathan is asking, what global preventive steps would you propose to increase world health and reduce the likelihood of another pandemic?
I already tell you, I mean, pandemics will come and we don't know the time. We only know that they will come, that's for sure. We knew that the Big Bang would come and has been, at least, I found documents of more than 10 years ago when it was said exactly what it would be. Now, this was not a complot, simply we had the data to be able to say this. To prevent it, I mean, the next one, the immediate one, possibly we should learn being more prepared in sharing our knowledge, in sharing our resources, and not having to send, you know, masks from one country to the other without being prepared. We should have a pandemic plan in place, and this may need a review of the international health regulations. We have a document, we have an agreement, and this should be corrected in certain points, making some aspects more compulsory. I mean, we have to be a little bit more strict in organizing the answer, in the mitigation. But then on the long run, I hope that really movements like, say, Friday for Futures may gain the awareness of the people, and we may really change something in that direction. Really, if we don't understand that health, for example, and environment are so linked together, we really will not go far away. And we cannot answer only with health care. I know I'm speaking to future medical doctors, but health care is not the only answer. We as doctors, as people, health professionals, we have a responsibility of making our people aware that health needs not primary prevention, what is now called primordial prevention, which means really the causes of the causes, to correct the health determinants. That's why it's so important to having introduced in Harvey the social rules of health, and I hope that soon it will be affecting the curriculum in all the health faculties, at least in Italy.
Thanks for the reply, Professor. There is another question that I received. What can we do in countries facing a difficult socio-political situation in order to find a pandemic, especially when there are no projects for vaccinating that population?
Diplomacy, it's very difficult. We cannot send the blue helmets, or we cannot send, a military answer. It doesn't work, or it's very, very complicated to install. We know that sanctions do not work. We have seen this in Syria, for example. Through the introduction of sanctions, we have those who have suffered more. It's not the political leadership, but the people. So we have to invent other mechanisms. Lots of diplomacy, finding the way. It's very difficult. Look, I mean, the very latest situation in Myanmar that I mentioned it before. If you have, again, on Myanmar playing different powers, European Union asking, or including the United States, asking for, to calm down, and China is not expressing itself on the issue because it's their area of dominance. So complicated. Geopolitics is complicated. But we leave it to the students of political sciences rather than to the studies of the Faculty of Medicine. No, we need to have a very open interdisciplinary approach, and diplomacy. I mean, opening minds of governments trying to discuss issues openly. I don't have the answer. We can find the answer all together.
Yeah.
But if we learn where we are, to speak to each other, to collaborate, to find solutions together rather than in competition one to the other. When we have to, in the university, to study something, let's study it together rather than in competition. I think this is little by little changing. I mean, nobody will, we don't have the power to change all these enormous things at once. But we can play our role, and this is my message. Everyone can play his own role, and with the wider awareness that I'm trying to propose to you, future health professionals, then we can do a lot better what we are doing as health professionals. And some of you will also become political leaders and may eventually bring this awareness at the other higher levels. I hope so.
So COVID had a question about what can individuals and physicians do to improve the global healthcare in this situation in respect to environment and consumerism. And I think you already replied to this question in, like, as you just finished your sentences, just by.
You can start at the individual level. At the individual level, you can say, okay, I become a vegetarian. I already made this choice. And not for philosophical, purely medical and health approach. You can avoid all processed foods. You can avoid all chemicals at home. And there are. I mean, if you explore internet, it's full. You can use bicarbonate or vinegar or whatever to clean. There are lots of natural tricks. So a more natural approach. We have to go, first of all, we have to make peace with nature. So this is a natural approach, an individual approach, and then a collective approach as a group, as a university association, as a network of social movements, and bringing it wider. We need, and then as consumers, if we really become majority, the industry will have to change. They will have to change the products because we don't buy them. But this is the herd immunity that we have to create. Works much better than vaccines.
So Lina is asking about the way we're using vaccines right now. I was wondering, would it be more effective for terminating the pandemic to try and vaccinate 20% of the population of all countries as proposed by the COVAX facility, rather than gaining herd immunities in single countries like Israel or the US?
The COVAX facility is not saying they want to reach the 20% and stop it. They say they want to contribute to the when is a kind of making a start. So to ensure that at least 20% of the population is vaccinated in those countries, and then local governments and eventually through also bilateral cooperation may increase that access to the numbers that we know should take us to the herd immunity. So the COVAX objective is not the total objective, is only the contribution of the facility to the wider goal. So 20% it will not be a solution. Although, I mean, if we with the vaccine we protect the people who are exposed, possibly to me it would be a good compromise. But I know many colleagues of mine would say that this is not enough, and that you have to vaccinate everybody. These are different aspects and a big debate also among epidemiologists. So there is not really a solution. But what I would stress that I really cannot believe that the vaccine alone will be a solution. And unfortunately, I do believe that vaccines current vaccines may be insufficient to face mutations, variants, and other changes in the overall scenario. And if we should come to the solution that every 6 months we have to revaccinate everybody, I see it quite difficult to work. Indeed, including, you say, for example, the influenza vaccine, we don't propose it to the whole population. We learned that influenza changes every 6 months or every year. So we know that it's a seasonal disease. Coronavirus is still not a seasonal disease. For the moment, it's there to stay all along the year. But influenza, we have a vaccine, but we do propose it only at risk populations. Actually, we know we have evidence-based that it does not work. It's not effective in people. It's effective only in people who have cardiovascular disease, elderly with cardiovascular disease and cardiopulmonary problems. It's not effective just in older populations. But this is evidence medicine. I mean, based on what we have in literature, and still we recommend it to all over, I don't know, 60s or whatever. So we cannot imagine that every single disease and every new pandemic can be faced only with vaccines, because then we will put all our energy, our resources just in producing vaccines instead of, and forgetting that now this year more people died from myocardial infarct because it could not reach the emergency unit because the emergency unit was occupied by COVID. We have these problems also. I mean, now there are interesting studies coming out soon on excess mortality, and will tell us possibly something more about how much excess mortality is due to COVID and how much is due, for example, to the bad management of other diseases. Things of people with cancer who could not receive the therapy, or people in dialysis or other kind of chronic diseases with regular care who could not receive it. Or in other country, people who were under treatment for HIV/AIDS and could not receive the treatment. TB, which is an upsurge. So it's kind of, we need to have an open mind. Don't focus too much on vaccine, and don't focus too much only on COVID, because health is a much more complex issue.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'm going to take the last one from the chat because it's a nice one to conclude, and then we can end our conversation. So I wanted to ask something about the formulated vaccines that we have now, and the fact that they're not really projected to be of safe use and distribution worldwide in the first place, given the temperature that they have to be conservated at, and like the means that you have to sustain them in general. So this is another aspect that would make it harder for a wider global distribution. And also, I was thinking as well about the various trials that involved countries, developing or third world countries, in the trial periods before distributing it worldwide, and if these countries were used as guinea pigs, or were there any strict regulations regarding what can be tried in those countries or not?
Okay, the first element is an interesting question because indeed it due to the logistic complication, I mean the minus 70 degree to carry or refrigeration, etc. The instability of mRNA vaccines is one of the issues. And this opened space for Chinese vaccines, as I said, which were distributed also Asia, Latin America, etc., because they are much more stable, and because they are built with the classic attenuated virus technique. Unfortunately, we don't know enough about the procedure. They have been approved in a number of countries, obviously, many countries, but not at FDA, not at EMA, so not at the European or American authorities, not yet, at least. But the fact that they used a different technique, a more classic technique, has helped them to position the vaccine in situation where those logistics could not be put in place. So there are also, again, geopolitical issues, even in what kind of vaccine you adopt. Then I have also another opinion I discussed with some of my colleague infectivologists, that such a vaccine, which is made of an attenuated virus, so a classical vaccine. Indeed, there are people who would say that the mRNA are not vaccines, but therapies. There is, including if you look into the journalistic language, they often speak of a drug and no more of a vaccine, because there is some criticism about the way these vaccines are produced. European Union, I understand, I have not the source, but I understand that they had to modify their legislation about transgenic products, which are prohibited in Europe, or at least limited, to admit these vaccines, because they are a product of genetic engineering, that's no doubt. So there are other issues which come with the vaccine. My opinion, or my hypothesis, together with other people, is that a classic vaccine may protect better from variants, because the genetic engineered vaccine, as you know, they are all focused on the spike protein, or S protein, it's called. So the only antigen that they really focus, that they target, is the spike protein. And they teach our cells to produce spike proteins to expose the immune system to respond to the spike protein. Instead, the classic vaccine exposes our immune system to the whole virus with all possible antigens which are in the capsule or in the spikes, etc. So it is more probable, that's just a hypothesis, that if there is a variant on the spike, you still have some antigens which are expressed in a different part of the virus and that our immune system can recognize. So possibly, has a wider scope, which, however, goes with the reduced efficacy. So there, you have to balance these kind of things. But there is a lot of debate. I mean, we are still debating, and there is still many, many things we don't know about the vaccines. This was the first question. What was the second question? I don't remember.
I was asking about the trials that were done in developing countries.
Yeah, many of the countries who have, or developing countries who have been introducing early vaccines, got this benefit because they allowed the tests to be done in the country. I know this very well for the Chinese vaccines, because I've been studying this aspect specifically, that those countries who participated in the tests of the Sinovac, for example, they then received, once the test was passed, they received the vaccine and could start with the vaccination. This is a reason. For example, the United Arab Emirates, they were guinea pigs, but willingly. It's part of
I understand that the countries did it willingly. Of course, I was asking if there were still, if those countries did it willingly because they were willing to take some risks, and if these risks were regulated by some, I don't know, if WHO had a say in which.
No, this was the national authorities of those countries who would agree on this.
So it was a private agreement between the producer and the country. Okay.
Bilateral agreement, which would give some advantage in the future.
Understood. Thank you. And then I think we can end now with the last questions. What advice would you give a medical student for his or her studies in future?
To open mind, to look beyond the patient, to look where the people live, where they're born, where they live, where they die, where they work, where they play, where they study. Understand the needs of the people, possibly before these people become the sick patient in front of us. So having an open mind, and then go on your, we need cardiologists, we need orthopedics, we need anesthesiologists. I mean, we need a specialist, obviously, but we need many more doctors in the community of what we currently have. And we need many more medical doctors and health professionals which are able to discuss and work with the people in other disciplines. Health is a result of the environment. Health is a result of education. Health is the results of working conditions. Health is the results of many other situations. And as medical doctors, if we are not prepared to speak with the professions who deal with this and see one health and being able to find a common solution, we will not find a solution. And as I said before, the system in which we will work in will not become sustainable. And you may end working only for the privileged people because the others will have no access to healthcare. So that's my message for you, for my future colleagues.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. I really enjoyed today's conference, and I think I speak for everyone when I say so. I don't want to do too many favoritism because we have a lot of professors that also teach in our course in the other conferences, and they're as interesting as this one. But I really think today's conference was a key one. We keep talking about vaccination, and there's this run for vaccines, not just from the countries and nationalism, but from the individuals as well. We all are trying to get our relatives get it, and we lose the big picture. And I think this conference really helped regain a more global perspective. So thank you very much for your time. Thank everyone for participating, and have a good rest of the night.
Bye to everybody, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good night. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.